This podcast is brought to you by the School of Advanced Study, University of London.
Well, I think we'll make a start. Thanks very much for coming along. As you probably picked up, I'm going to say a few opening words. We won't go on for too long, you'll be delighted to know. Then Francis Beckett will come in, Ian Birchall and Mike Sheridan over there. We'll then have a break and then come back and have some discussion. That's the format. The finishing time is not particularly determined, but we are now back in the main IHR premises and it does operate like a pub, so closing time here is 4 o'clock on a Saturday. I don't expect we'll go on that long, but we can do if we want to. But certainly,
10 minutes drinking up to
you get the kind of yes, you do in effect. You get like Baron will come round and say, closing time. Can you please finish up your discussions, please? So I've been having a look round the year 1945, and I noticed. And I don't know whether this is going to be repeated, we'll find out in due course. 1945 was an exceptionally good year for wine. And the Financial Times, in fact, printed a piece just last week saying that some fine Bordeaux wines were up for auction from 1945, and I think the asking price was several £1,000s for a case of 12 bottles of fine 1945 wine. So I don't think Mr. Attlee was a wine drinker, although Francis might be able to. Well, he was. Oh, well, there we are. So he may well have. That may well be a legacy of 1945. That's endures, at least for the person that buys the. That vintage wine. But I suppose 70 years on, we have a general election in Britain in May. This is an historical conference, so we're not really here to give direct political thoughts. You can do in the discussion if you want to. But clearly 1945 was an election held in a context of austerity, and rightly or wrongly, the election coming up in May will also be one held in the context of austerity. And of course we've seen over the past month the election of a Syriza government in Greece, which has focused the issue of austerity and how a left-wing government deals with difficult economic circumstances, but still pursues, if you like, a progressive agenda, if it does. And that's, of course, subject of some debate. In fact, the editorial of the Financial Times today welcomes Syriza's retreat, as it sees it, from its promises it's made to voters. That is obviously a matter for some debate, and certainly I think I was pilloried jointly with the Financial Times on Twitter earlier in the week for being part of the commentariat that was offering thoughts to Syriza whilst having no responsibility for the decisions. Well, actually what I was mainly doing was retweeting what the Financial Times said, which is not quite the same thing as offering my own thoughts, but Twitter often manages to confuse things. And nevertheless, I mean, there's no question that the 70th anniversary is starting to get some kind of purchase. What kind of purchase, I'm not sure. I mean, I tried to invite a number of other speakers here. In particular, we were keen to get women to talk about gender issues and that kind of side of things. I mean, not just that, obviously, but in terms of not just having a load of old blokes, let's put it like that, on the platform, which is what we do have. But that proved extraordinarily difficult, as did getting other people to talk about 1945, and that something there which was quite interesting. I'm not quite sure exactly what what was behind that. But certainly from the right, there were people already trying to trash, I suppose would be the modern word, Attlee's reputation. In fact, there's a chap called Bruce Everest, that may not be his name, but it's his Twitter name, who tweets me regularly with an opinion piece that he's got on a blog somewhere saying that Attlee was the worst Prime Minister ever. That is, if you don't include Gordon Brown, Tony Blair. In other words, he's just a Tory who thinks that Attlee was terrible. That doesn't really make for very good history, but it's kind of interesting. That kind of stuff is going on. So, I suppose in terms of the points that I would want to make, the framework, this is what's on the sort of running order, as it were. The most recent, aside from what I just talked about, stuff around 1945, is Ken Loach's film in 2013 on the 1945 Labour government. I guess many people here would have seen the film, which I think was a powerful piece, and it clearly got an extensive audience, and it's available on DVD and so on. So I suspect it will get more people watching this year again. And it's an historical provocation, in my view. Ken Loach was rightly clear in the question and answer that followed the film. For those that saw it, if you remember, that in the sort of initial showings, the film was shown, and then there was an audience, I think it was in Brixton or somewhere in London, where they did a Q&A with Owen Jones and so on, immediately after, which was then sort of video cast after the film for the people that had seen it. He was clear in that session that the film was not a history, noting that a 10-part series would be needed for that subject. Well, maybe 20 or 30 years ago, the funding for that would have been forthcoming. One thinks of Days of Hope, for example, about the general strike, the anniversary of which, of course, is next year. But I suspect we won't be seeing that, unfortunately. So Ken Loach's film will probably be the thing. But the film did make some historical points, and it's probably worth saying, although not, as it were, labouring. The film emphasises the positive elements of Attlee's government, the introduction of the health service, the nationalisation of key parts of the economy, and so on. And the argument, of course, has been made, most people here will be quite familiar with this point, that these were needed for British capitalism to continue after 1945. But a Churchill government would not have done them, at least not in the way that Attlee's government did. Although, on balance, the Tories did not reverse them when they returned to office in 1951. And it's a kind of strange paradox in some ways that the right of the Conservative Party, and indeed UKIP, are often to be found talking about we need to take Britain back to the 1950s, because the 1950s were characterised by a Britain that had been shaped by those Attlee government changes, though they don't mention that, obviously. So that's a kind of strange kind of thing. In the film, anyway, John Rees makes the point that the 1945 government was not about mobilising popular change from below, but implementing it bureaucratically from above. And I think that's kind of, to some extent, undeniable, although it's not exactly an unfamiliar model. Beyond that, the Attlee government was responsible for the introduction of the Cold War in Britain, with a rather right-wing Foreign Secretary in Bevin, and the foreign policy, as might be expected, I think, for the left anyway, left a considerable amount to be desired. No doubt we'll hear some more about that, and John Newsinger, in fact, was going to speak about that, and that continues to be a very significant issue, and perhaps one that doesn't get as much discussion as the health service and the nationalisation. Specifically in terms of Loach's film. A few important historical points. As the film suggests, the 1945 landslide for Labour was not really expected in that way. I think, Francis, you make the point in the last edition of your biography of Attlee that Attlee himself expected a Lab government to be the outcome of that poll. And no doubt Labour activists and others played their role, but it was the services vote, of course, in particular perhaps, and the radicalisation that the war had brought that delivered that significant Labour majority. And the film makes that, Loach's film makes that point. The point being that a Labour government that delivers significant change, however it delivers it, would need wider forces at work than just the narrow kind of activist base that might be working away all the time. So while the 1945 government had people like Ernest Bevin as a leading figure, it arguably was not an administration of the Labour left as it would be understood today. And again, we might find echoes of the Syriza government in Greece in that. Well, the fact that Labour only narrowly won the 1950 election and then ran into the sand altogether in 1951 perhaps makes the point, and I think this is quite a difficult thing to understand in the modern context, that ministers did not have in mind an overarching long-term programme for change, or if they did, they weren't particularly clear about what the strategy was going to be to achieve that. But that is, of course, was against the background, as I hinted at right at the beginning, of martial aid, of austerity, and so on, and tremendous difficulties in actually achieving change, which nevertheless they managed to do. The 1945 election was the product of a specific historical moment, and that, I guess, will be the key point that Loach's film makes. And the moment can't be replicated, but such moments do occur from time to time, a period when significant change comes quite suddenly, perhaps, quite rather unexpectedly, onto the agenda. And a contributor to the Q&A after the film, who identified themselves as a member of the Labour Party, noted that change was often slow to come, and that it had taken 45 years from the formation of the Labour Representation Committee to the appearance of the Attlee Government. And I think when you look at that statement, you'd have to say, well, there's some truth in it, but there are other points one could make. Moments of change can flash up quite quickly. It's also true that change is not to be diverted into existing channels. In a sense, I suppose you could argue what happened certainly after 1950-51. Then the forces at work over a much longer historical timescale also need to be mobilised. So, for example, when Jack Jones and Hugh Scandon took control of major trade unions in the UK for the left, very broadly defined, perhaps not my left, but the left, as will be seen generally, in the early 1970s. It was a project they and others have been working on since the 1930s. So, while we hope work for political sea change, at the same time, there's the slog of shifting what a previous Labour Deputy Prime Minister referred to as the tectonic plates underneath as well. The longer term changes that are at work, and I guess we come here to look at 70 years since the Attlee Government. That's one of the perspectives that we want to keep in mind, not just to look at what that government in 1945 did or did not do against in the context that it was able to do it, but also to think, well, after 70 years, what is the legacy of that, and what are the kind of pointers, for example, about again a government facing austerity. Then is that something that is going to inform discussion now when circumstances although different, have some degree of similarity in respect of the economic circumstances. So that's just a few kind of opening shots on the discussion. I'll now shut up and pass over to Francis Beckett, who, whilst not the official biographer of Clement Attlee, I think it would be fair to say is written by far the most interesting book about Attlee. And I reread it recently in preparation for this, and it does give a real kind of flavour, of what Attlee was like, which is kind of interesting in some ways for a modern somebody now to think about how he developed, what he was like, and so on. And you've got a new edition coming out, so yeah. Okay. Anyway, over to you, Francis.
Thank you very much. But roughly how long do you want me to go on for?
It's up to you. Half an hour's fine if you want to speak a little bit more or a little bit less. Yeah.
All right. Well, what I'm going to do for the next sort of 2.5 hours or so then.
Okay. Well, that's up to you.
First, is try and explain to you why I think why I have not exactly an uncritical admiration for Attlee, but why I think he is still, even though he's undergone a considerable rehabilitation in past years, he's still underestimated generally. By the way, the biography that Keith very kindly referred to is coming out in a completely rewritten, but very largely rewritten, updated form. It will be out in April, and just to quell the rising panic that I feel in the room, I do have all the forms here, which I will leave on the desk for anybody who wants one, at the discounted price of £8.99. A couple of things about what you said, Keith. I'm very interested in. I didn't know that point about wine, that 1945 was a good year for wine. I must say it's a little surprising, given that most of the wine growing areas in France have been under German occupation for the previous 4 years. Yep. A few of them were in Vichy France, but most of them, I suspect, were in directly occupied territory. I don't think we ought to examine the lessons of that more closely than we absolutely have to. Anyway, I'm very interested to hear it. I don't suppose I'll ever get to sample it.
Well, you never know.
The other thing is, you talk about Tories. The fact is, clever Tories say the same thing as I say about Attlee. Clever Tories understand that Attlee, they may not like what he did, but they understand an effective politician when they see one. Margaret Thatcher had enormous respect for Attlee and said so more than once. That may not actually commend him to anybody here in the room. But remember that Margaret Thatcher was a supremely effective politician. She was somebody who knew what she wanted and how to make the machine deliver it. That's what makes an effective Prime Minister, and I would argue that there were only two, at that level, there were only two really effective Prime Ministers in the whole of the 20th century. Attlee was the first and Margaret Thatcher was the second. I think if he had lived, we might have counted Campbell Bannerman as a third. But certainly those two. And while it is true, as Keith rightly says, that 1945 was a historical moment, was one of those moments that Jim Callaghan referred to when the tectonic plates of British politics shifted, it wasn't the only one in the century. And what really matters is whether you've got the people there who understand how to take advantage. And my view would be that if Attlee had not been there, if, say, Herbert Morrison had been the Prime Minister, or even Ernest Bevin, or who else might it have been? Really, could only have been either Bevin or Morrison, I think. Realistic, I don't think Dalton or Cripps were ever really runners. If it had been any of those, then I believe less would have been done, because you would have had a less effective Prime Minister at the centre of it. I'm going to develop that in a moment or two. But if you look at, I think there were probably at least 4, possibly 5 dates on which the tectonic plates shifted, as Jim Callaghan put it. It was 1905. And Campbell Bannerman was there to make effective use of it. There was 1918 and nobody was there to make effective use of it. Then there was 1945. Then there was 1979. The tectonic plates shifted in another direction, as Callaghan rightly pointed out. And there was Thatcher there. Had the Tories had anybody else leading them, they would have achieved much less as a result of that 1979 shift. The last one, I believe, was in 1979, when perhaps we had a government that had less will to make use of the moment. So, we start with the Attlees. A few of the Attlee stories. You've all heard the famous ones. The cabinet minister who cabinet minister said, "Oh, why do you want me to go prime minister?" Attlee said, "Not up to it." But there's lots more. When I just want to, I want to give you, just as a flavour of the man, one or two that you may not know of. One is, when I was first researching this book, I went to the National Sound Archives and I listened to a few Attlee interviews, including one that he gave in retirement, and I'm pretty sure it was Malcolm Muggeridge, but who was doing the interviewing. And there's this wonderful moment. You really have to listen to it to appreciate it fully. It's a wonderful moment. Malcolm Muggeridge begins the interview. He's trying to draw a very strained analogy between socialism and Machiavellianism. Socialism, Machiavellianism, having the and they all in simple same thing. And Attlee waited, and then he said, "No." I wish I could do that. I know I couldn't. I know practically nobody I know could do that. But it is just listening to it on a tape. It's a wonderful moment. And for those 2 or 3 seconds of dead air time, the panic in the studio screams at you. Another is one of Peter Hennessy's stories, which it's 1950, and Attlee is in Washington. He's seen President Truman, and the British ambassador at the time was in the habit of entertaining the ambassadors of the New Zealand and Australia and Canada on Friday night for drinks to brief them on the world situation. And he thought, well, the Prime Minister's here, so the Prime Minister could do it. So they all come in, they all have a drink, and then the ambassador gives a kind of tour d'horizon of the issues facing the world, and then he turns to Attlee and he said, "Prime Minister." And Attlee took his pipe out of his mouth and he said, "Quite." And he put his pipe back in his mouth. Another new one, which I only came across from just as I was revising this new edition, and it's in a book by a group of Labour historians in Oxford, whose title I can't now remember, but I have attributed it properly in the book. It's a very, very new book that's just out in the last few weeks, I think. And it's Attlee as leader of the opposition, just back from Spain and convinced that the policy of non-intervention is a sham and has to be ended. And he goes to Oxford and he makes a speech largely to left-wing undergraduates about how this must be ended. And you can imagine it wasn't exactly a rabble-rousing speech, but he was saying the right things and they were delighted with him, and they hoisted him on their shoulders and they marched him through the streets of Oxford in triumph. And those a little far away could see his lips moving. They could see he was saying something, but nobody could quite hear what Attlee was saying. And it was only years afterwards that somebody revealed what it was that he had been saying. What he had been saying was, "Please put me down, I shall miss the 9:34 to London." Now, this is really, all these stories, these Attlee stories. Peter Hennessy is the repository of an awful lot of them, although there's quite a few that have come up since he was writing about this area. All these stories have a purpose. They're not just great fun. They have a purpose. because to me they serve to explode the myths about Attlee. The first myth is that Attlee was simply a sort of effective cabinet chairman, and fortunately there were a few great men in the government, Bevin, Ernest Bevin, Herbert Morrison, Stafford Cripps, who were able to provide the intellectual firepower of the government, the motive force of the government. I think this is the exact opposite of the truth. I think Attlee in domestic affairs was the driving force, both the pilot and the engine room of the 1945 government. That if anybody else had been in charge, much, much less would have been achieved. I say in domestic affairs, foreign affairs were largely left to Ernest Bevin, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time on foreign affairs this morning, although it might come up in discussion, but except to say that I think that was to the detriment of British foreign policy, and it from that certainly stems what I think was the worst decision made throughout those 6 years, which was the decision to develop an independent nuclear weapon. It is certainly clear, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but it is certainly quite clear from the papers now that initially Attlee was opposed to this, and he was brought round to it by Bevin. Uncharacteristically, he was brought round to it by Colin. Having come round to it, he was behind it for a little more. But in terms of changing the nature, changing the way we live in Britain, the achievements of the Attlee government, firstly, are enormous. I'm pretty sure that's coming round in this room. But secondly, they were Attlee's achievements. The second myth is that he was a modest and self-effacing little man. Attlee was probably the least modest person. He behaved modestly. He was actually massively immodest. He had a kind of self-belief that most of us would envy. Most of us who talk far, far more than he did, and far more loudly, and far more, we don't have that kind of self-belief. And I recognise in myself, a lot of us do, I suspect, a kind of most of us, I think, and I certainly go through my life thinking that one day I'm going to be found out. And Attlee never did that. Attlee never ever did that. This view, incidentally, has always been enforced by my partner, who says that she cannot understand how I've managed to fool so many people for so long on such little knowledge. But Attlee had an absolute unshakable self-belief. He was a man who could take a major decision and go to bed and sleep the night. And he never felt the need to discuss his decisions. I just dwell for a moment on his relationship with his wife, which was a very, very close one. She's generally portrayed as having been a rather difficult woman. She probably was, but the relationship between the two of them was very, very close. But it was completely non-political. He never discussed political issues. He would tell her anecdotes out of Parliament, and they would discuss them. But he did not. He was kind of the kind of suburban bank manager who never takes his work home. Who wants, and his daughter said this to me. He wanted a home that had nothing to do with the work that he had to do every day. He wanted to put it now. When you're that's all right if you're a suburban bank manager, but I think a pretty hard trick to pull off if you're Prime Minister. And I don't think I can think of another Prime Minister who ever did pull it off. Nearest probably is Macmillan. Macmillan got somewhere near to pulling off a trick like that. Macmillan read Trollopon, never tired of this dreadful joke that he went to bed every night with a trollop. And Macmillan once said of Margaret Thatcher, "I wish she'd read a book." It's so he actually, to a greater extent than any other Prime Minister, even Macmillan, was able to sort of just switch off. He would take the decision, he would go away, he would go to bed. The third myth that I want to attack is the myth, and I'll come back to this one. I won't go on for 2.5 hours, but that was a joke. Just want to be clear about that. I'll stop before we get to. I'll stop within the next 20 minutes or so. The idea that the Attlee method could never work. Now, this is the most enduring. Everybody says, everybody said, well, it might have been just a great Prime Minister then, Francis, but it never worked. And yet it would. It would work fine today. It's true that he didn't. He never mastered television because he never had to. He would have, if he'd stayed leader for just a couple more years, he would have had to. And there is that wonderful clip which Peter Hennessy talks about in the 1950 election, where as he gets into his car, there's a television, somebody from BBC Television News. So Prime Minister, you just called the election. Have you any thoughts on politics? No. And he got 3 questions, he gets no answer, and eventually in desperation he says, "Is there anything else you'd like to say, Prime Minister?" And Attlee says, "No." It is, and when I read it in, I can't remember whether it was in Peter Hennessy's The Prime Ministers or in Never Again. I think it's in the Prime Ministers. When I read it, I went onto YouTube and found the clip, and you can do that, and it is fun. I don't know what you put in, but YouTube is terribly simple, and you put in Clement Attlee 1950 election or something, you'll get it. It's just wonderful fun to listen to. You can see him sort of pausing as he's getting into his car, much as you might with somebody who was really boring, but you desperately wanted to get away from, but you didn't actually want to be rude to if you could avoid it. So there he is with one foot in his car, saying, "No, not really, no. Well, I'm about to go to the committee meeting to discuss that." And it's just a wonderful thing to listen to. If you've got 5 minutes to spare and you want to be amused, just listen to it. But the Attlee method could work perfectly well today. He never mastered television, as I say, but he did have to master radio, so he did. And his use of radio during the 1945 election was absolutely masterly. It was, in the 1945 election, Churchill, supposedly the greatest broadcaster that we've ever had in government, was completely outmaneuvered in that medium, in his own medium, in the medium that he had made his own throughout the war, by the Labour leader. And whether the Attlee method could work today actually is going to matter, in my view, in the next 3 or 4 weeks. And I'll come back to that. Attlee's secret, what he had, the reason that he was able to do what he was able to do, was his absolute certainty. He had a decision-making process like a steel trap. He never revisited decisions. The one thing that the Prime Minister has to be able to do, he was very, very good. The one thing that ruined poor Gordon Brown, who it's now clear, when confronted by a difficult decision, was frozen like a rabbit in the headlights. We ought to have known that Gordon Brown was like that from 1994. Because, sorry, this has nothing to do with Attlee, but it is just a thought. When, as historians, have you ever read about somebody who's within an inch of being Prime Minister, who looks at the vital moments and says, might be a bit of a bloody election here, might be a bit of better let old so-and-so do it, really. You don't find that. Top politicians don't do that, except for poor Gordon, and we should have understood then that if we were looking for a saviour from Blairism, Gordon wasn't it. Anyway, that was the Attlee secret. He had that sort of decision-making process. Now, I said that the Attlee method could work now. In a sense, it's going to have to. Possibly the part of what I want to say that you will disagree with, you're most likely to disagree with. I think Ed Milliband is a Clem Attlee figure. I think he is at least potentially a Clem Attlee figure. I think he's been advised that he's got to play. He's got to turn himself into something different. But I think this for lots of reasons. Firstly, because he's not a great public speaker, and Clem Attlee wasn't a great public speaker. He has a persona that is a little bit like Attlee. People say, what a funny little man, odd-looking man he is, odd-sounding man he is. As they always said with Attlee. But when you come down to it, when you look at it, he seems to be able to take major decisions against a lot of advice that have far-reaching consequences, and as far as we know, go to bed at night and never revisit them. And that's the crucial thing that he's done. He's done a number of things that I don't think another Labour leader would have done on energy, on attacking the News International empire, on calling for the breakup of News International, when most of his own shadow cabinet were still saying, hang on a minute, we might still be in the era when you can't win a general election without the support of the Murdoch press. Most of them were urging caution. And he thought about it. He didn't take a wild decision. He thought about it and decided that was what you had to do. And I think we saw it again yesterday. The tuition fees pledge, although it's actually in itself not a big thing at all, doesn't change the way higher education is going to be funded in this country, doesn't make a massive difference to anything, either for good or isn't even going to make a huge difference to the students it affects. They're still going to be lumbered with a load of debt that none of us ever had to deal with. That's a bit presumptuous, really. I'm looking around the room and I say none of us have had to do that. Sorry about that. We'll come back. But it is terribly indicative of the direction of travel. I think everybody has recognised it. I think the Tories recognise that. I think Vince Cable recognises it. Which is why he became hysterical about it yesterday. Yes. That I must say, if I were a Liberal leader these days, I would not be getting huffing and puffing about tuition fees of all things in the world. Anyway, I think that the totemic significance of it was enormous, because what it was saying is that the direction of travel can change. I think Ed Milliband is playing Clem Attlee to Tony Blair's Ramsay MacDonald. I think there are an awful lot of analogies. I won't do that, but I think there are a lot of analogies between Blair and MacDonald, and both personally and politically, and in terms of the way that they operate. So, I've not actually met Ed Milliband, and I'd be terrified to do so, because I'd be terrified that I'd pat him on the head and say, I greatly admire your father, young man. But one can't do that sort of thing. But perhaps some of you have the same temptation. But I'll wind up on this point, and we can have any sort of discussion that you want on it. But I think that Attlee, this is a very good time for us to be remembering what sort of figure he was, what a Labour government is supposed to be about, and what a Labour government is supposed to do, and what sort of leader it requires to do it, and whether or not maybe we've got the same sort of, because the historical analogy doesn't work, because we're not in a tectonic plate shifting year as we were in 1945. So, you know, I'm not saying that historically we will ever see Ed Milliband as the Clem Attlee de nos jours, because he can't be, because he isn't in a situation where he can be. Also, he's a relatively young man with relatively little government experience. I mean, Attlee came to the job, one of the strengths that he had in 1945 was he came to government knowing how the machine worked. In those days, it was all right for a man of 60 to become Prime Minister. These days, you wouldn't be allowed at all. If you know how to do the job, you're obviously incapable of doing it. But in those days, that was okay. These days it wouldn't be. But so he doesn't have any of those advantages that Attlee had in 1945. Neither the level of personal experience of government and of how the machine worked that Attlee had, nor the benefit, the enormous benefit of the shifting of the tectonic plates that we saw in I didn't see it, but a lot of people saw in 1945. But in terms of the sort of Labour leader that he is, the sort of person he is, the sort of work that he can do as Labour leader, I think there's a serious analogy, and I think it'd be very interesting if we do get a Labour government or a Labour-led government after the next general election, to see whether he turns into a Prime Minister who is just a little bit like Ernest Attlee. Okay, I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Francis. I want to bring in Ian Birchall now, who's going to talk, I think, specifically on the foreign policy aspects of the Attlee government, or some of them anyway. Well, we'll find out. Anyway,
you'll find out. Yeah.
Okay. Over to you, Ian. Thank you.
Right. I hope everybody can hear me. And could I just point out, I'm in process of going deaf, so if you disagree, I won't be able to hear you. Okay, 1945 will be remembered in Britain, above all, as the only year, past or future, in which a Labour government was elected, which did anything of significance for the class it claimed to represent. But 1945 was also a major turning point in world history. Firstly, it saw the establishment of a new world order in which international politics was dominated by the confrontation between the USA and the USSR. Secondly, it saw the beginning of the end for the colonial empires of Europe, which had largely disappeared within 20 years. Any understanding of both the achievements and the limitations of the Attlee government requires that it be set in this international context. What I'm going to try and do is make a small contribution to such an understanding by comparing the colonial policy of the Attlee government with that of its near neighbour in France. Now in 1945 the map of the world was still dominated by European colonial empires. The British Empire, which in 1918 had been the biggest empire in human history, was still largely intact. Its nearest rival, the French Empire, had before 1940 covered nearly 1/10 of the world's land area and 5% of the world's population. By 1965, all that remained of these two empires was debris and anomalies. Now, one of the defining acts of the Attlee government was the decision to move rapidly towards Indian independence in 1947. The Tories in Parliament did not oppose the required legislation, and Churchill, the arch-imperialist, actually complimented Attlee. Now, having unloaded the jewel in the crown, Britain moved away from empire quite rapidly. The process was finalised by Macmillan and the wind of change in around 1960. Now, I've no desire to minimise either the brutality of the British Empire or the courage and determination shown by the people in the colonies who resisted it. I'd go along entirely with the analysis presented in John Newsinger's book, The Blood Never Dried. John Newsinger may be exaggerating, though I think only slightly, when he claims that British repression in Kenya was in some respects worse than the French war in Algeria, but adds the British were just better at covering it up. Nonetheless, it's the case that there was really no significant public opposition to the course of British decolonisation. The League of Empire Loyalists, who used to disrupt political meetings in the 1950s, who advocated maintaining and rebuilding the empire, were very much on the British political fringe. It's true that from time to time events in Malaysia, Kenya, Cyprus, and then in the 60s in Aden made the front pages of the newspapers from time to time. But the question of the empire didn't make much impact on British political life. In none of the general elections from 1945 to 1964 was decolonisation a significant, let alone a decisive issue. All the elections were fought primarily on domestic economic questions. By contrast, in the French 1955 election campaign, a poll asked voters to name the most important issue facing the incoming government. 25% named North Africa, as against 15% for wages and the cost of living. Only once did the disintegration of empire threaten to disturb political life, with the Suez Crisis of 1956-57, when a dishonest and incompetent Tory Prime Minister was removed and replaced by a rather more intelligent Conservative, Harold Macmillan. The French experience was very different. After the end of the German occupation and the Second World War, France was at peace for less than 2 years before embarking on a major colonial war in Indochina. This lasted until 1954, when it ended with a humiliating defeat at Dien Bien Phu. The French lost 20,000 soldiers. Total casualties were at least 400,000. The defeat in Indochina was followed within months by the outbreak of the war in Algeria. This lasted until French withdrawal in 1962. Total French military losses were around 25,000. Some 300,000 Algerians died. Unlike in Indochina, conscripts were used. Almost every French family had a stake in the conflict. The Algerian Liberation Front, the FLN, organised among Algerian workers in mainland France. In October 1961, a peaceful demonstration by Algerians in Paris was attacked by police and over 200 were killed. The pro-French Algeria secret army organisation launched violent action in mainland France with bombings and an attempted assassination of the president. All this was too much for the French political system. The Fourth Republic was notoriously politically unstable, 21 governments in 12 years. 4 Fourth Republic governments fell specifically as a result of colonial questions, and in 1958 the Fourth Republic itself collapsed amid rumours of civil war, leading to the return from retirement of General de Gaulle at the price of the establishment of a new constitution which enshrined authoritarian presidential power. This isn't the place to examine these wars in detail. What I'm looking at is the fact that it seems to me that the die was cast in 1945. It was in 1945 that the French decided that they would restore and hold on to the colonial empire they'd possessed before 1939, while Attlee's regime, pragmatically and somewhat half-heartedly, recognised that the time to withdraw had arrived. Now, the French government in 1945 had as its Prime Minister General Charles de Gaulle, who'd headed the Free French forces in exile. But the main parties backing his government were of the left or the centre-left. The Communists, who'd been at the heart of the internal resistance movement, the Socialists, the other major working class party, and the Christian Democrats. Now, there were 2 essential points in 1945 at which France's fateful decision was consolidated. The first came in May 1945 in Algeria. Germany had surrendered on the 7th of May. On the 8th of May, a victory parade was held in Sétif, a market town in Kabylia, a mountainous area on the northern coast of Algeria. Many Muslims gathered, including members of the Muslim Scouts, a legal organisation set up by the main nationalist organisation, the Algerian People's Party. The nationalists wanted a large but peaceful demonstration. One of the police opened fire, killing a boy carrying a flag. This enraged the crowd. Some Muslims were armed, most weren't, but they used knives, bottles, clubs and railings. All Europeans were considered to be the enemy after long years of colonial repression. They were killed and their bodies mutilated. Some 100 Europeans died. The rising spread throughout the region produced a rapid and disproportionate response from the authorities. Violence continued for 4 or 5 days. There were executions and widespread arrests. The attacks were indiscriminate, the aim being to teach the whole Muslim population to know their place. Probably at least 15,000 died, some claim as many as 50,000. Even on a very conservative estimate, the Europeans killed 50 Muslims for every European life lost. And for many Algerians, this was a vital turning point. The young Ahmed Ben Bella, who'd been serving in the French army, was invited to stay on, but he recalled Sétif made it clear he must refuse and devote himself to his own community. Now, the second question came in the autumn. After Hiroshima and Nagasaki, Japan surrendered very quickly. And this left the problem of what was to happen in Indochina. At the Potsdam Conference, in the summer of '45, it was decided that Chinese forces would occupy the northern part of Indochina and British troops would occupy the southern half. Now, why was Britain involved in Indochina, which had long been a French colony? First, France was still recovering from 4 years of occupation, needed time to reorganise its armed forces. Sorry, my throat's seizing up as well. A drop of water would be very nice, yes. Thank you. Sorry?
Still or sparkling?
Oh, still, please, yes. Thank you very much. I'm just, this general senile decay.
I think most of us are suffering from that.
Which is generally alleviated by water.
Yeah.
Sorry, what?
It's usually alleviated by water.
Yes, very rejuvenated.
Thanks very much. Right. Secondly, the British Foreign Office was very keen to cooperate with the French because they believed British and French imperialisms had a common interest in face of the Americans, who were very much in favour of dismantling the European colonial empires. Now, de Gaulle, in particular, was a hardline imperialist. In September 1945, he gave a broadcast announcing the founding of the Fourth Republic. Our ports are reopening, our fields are being ploughed, our ruins are being cleared away, almost all those who left France have returned, we are recovering our empire, we are established on the Rhine, we are taking back our place in the world. Now, there was an alternative. On the 2nd of September 1945, Ho Chi Minh declared the independence of the Democratic Republic of Vietnam. The British forces, making use of recently defeated Japanese troops, intervened to prevent this and ensure that France would be able to reclaim its colony. The newly elected Labour MP Tom Dryburgh, who was visiting Indochina, offered to try and mediate between Britain and Ho Chi Minh, but his letter was delayed by the Commander-in-Chief of Allied Land Forces, General Gracie. Now, the Labour Prime Minister, Attlee, was a busy man, but he must have been aware that large numbers of British troops, in fact mainly Indians and Gurkhas, were invading an Asian country. In fact, the Cabinet minutes show that Attlee and Bevin were directing this policy. What's interesting is that this episode receives not a single mention in biographies of Attlee by Francis Beckett or Kenneth Harris. Alan Bullock's sycophantic life of Labour Foreign Secretary Ernest Bevin gives it only a couple of paragraphs, unquestioningly justifying the British role. Now, We might wonder what would have happened if Britain had not done its French ally a good turn at this point. Had an independent Indochina been established at this point, when Ho Chi Minh was playing down his communist connections, that he actually dissolved the Indo-Chinese Communist Party in November 1945, if an independent Vietnam had been established at that stage, then the long French War and the even longer American War need never have happened. 2 million or more deaths would have been unnecessary. Now, it's interesting to ask how the judgment of history might balance this against the creation of the National Health Service. Certainly, I would say there was a great deal of truth in the Viet Minh broadcast of the 5th of October 1945, which stated, "The British delegation is entirely responsible for the bloodshed in Vietnam, which heralds a Third World War. The cowardly French imperialists could not start trouble within Vietnam without the support of the British delegation." Now, what's clear, and you're going to stop nodding now.
Yes, okay.
Well, just wait. What's clear is that the French left made no visible opposition to the re-establishment of the French colonial empire. After Sétif, the French Communist Party's daily paper blamed the events on a handful of big landowners who were responsible for starvation and demanded the dismissal of pro-Vichy officials. And it demanded an announcement of the date of local elections. A few days later, the paper called explicitly for the punishment of the Hitlerite killers who took part in the events of the 8th of May and the pseudo-nationalist leaders who have deliberately tried to deceive the Muslim masses. By implication, pointing the finger at the PPA, the organisation led by Masali Haj, which had taken over from the North African Star that was banned by the Popular Front government in 1937. The communist François Billou, who was a member of de Gaulle's government throughout 1945, subsequently claimed, "We didn't know the extent of the events of May 1945 and the repression until much later, for not all questions were brought before the government. Many things were settled directly by de Gaulle with the ministers concerned." Now, this may very well be true. De Gaulle certainly had an authoritarian style, but the French Communist Party was a mass organisation with over 500,000 members, including several thousand, European and Muslim, in Algeria. It could hardly claim it didn't know what was going on. The PCF Communist Party likewise expressed no opposition to the recolonisation of Indochina. Indeed, as late as 1947, after full-scale war had broken out, communist ministers respected cabinet discipline by voting for war credits, though communist deputies were allowed to show their opposition by abstaining. The Socialist Party was equally keen to preserve the empire. Its position was summed up by Roger Vitillard. As far as the colonies were concerned, the Socialists were sceptical of the ability of the emerging nationalisms to take on a genuine independence, and so they put forward the position that, left to their own devices, the overseas countries would inevitably fall under the influence of either America or the USSR. With the exception of a few militants on the left, none of the socialist leaders questioned colonialism. Hence, while advocating reforms in the areas of education, health, working conditions, etc., the SFIO, the Socialist Party's fundamental position, was to assimilate Algeria to France. A slightly more critical position came from the independent left-inclined press. For example, the journal Combat, which had begun as an underground resistance paper, and in which the novelist Albert Camus played a leading role. On the 23rd of May, 1945, Combat published an article by Camus headed, "It is justice which will save Algeria from hatred." He commended the movement Amis de la Démocratie, which advocated the extension of rights of citizenship and a social policy of equality. These aims, which Camus claimed were supported by communists, socialists and radicals, were described as a reasonable and humane programme, and he argued that they represented France's last chance of saving its future in North Africa. In other words, he favoured justice and reconciliation, but was quite clear that Algeria's future must be as an integral part of the French nation. Now, in terms of the population in general, it's easy to understand why there was general acceptance of France's colonial policy. The defeat of Germany and the prospects for a new post-war society were at the front of everybody's minds. Supporters of the Communist Party were inclined to accept the party's judgment because of its resistance record. Edgar Morin, who joined the party during the resistance, recalled he had worried about the party's line on Sétif. We were absolutely certain that we were the representatives of all the victims of oppression in the world. We were sure that the least of our actions, even if it were clumsy or brutal, would hasten the emancipation of all humanity. Only slowly did a realisation of the nature of French colonial rule begin to spread. On the 22nd of December 1945, the independent left paper Franc-Tireur published a vigorous attack on French policy in Indochina, citing a letter from a French soldier which compared French actions in Indochina to the massacre at Oradour, one of the worst atrocities during the Nazi occupation of France. Jacques Soustelle, the colonial minister, considered the effect on French public opinion to be disastrous. So why the difference between France and Britain? Those who argue that Labour was and remained an imperialist party have to say that Britain got out of India because there was no alternative. John Newsinger, who sadly is not with us to defend himself, John Newsinger assures us any attempt to impose British terms on the Indian people was thought likely to involve another 15 years occupation of the country. This was just not possible. There were neither the troops nor the money. But there was an alternative. Britain could have firmly insisted that India would remain British permanently, sent 500,000 national servicemen to maintain order, and withdrawn in humiliation a few years later on. Those who say that this would have been unthinkable should remember that that is precisely what the French did in Algeria. And France, emerging from Nazi occupation, was weaker economically and militarily than Britain. Were Britain's rulers cleverer, more long-sighted than those in France? Seems unlikely. It may be true that Attlee would certainly have won television's mastermind, as Francis Beckett claims, but there were clever fellows in the French government too. It was ideology, not intelligence, that was at stake. Nor is it enough to argue that Algeria was a special case. It's true Algeria had a large settled population, many with personal or family connections with mainland France. True also that Algeria was constitutionally part of France rather than a colony, although the majority of its inhabitants did not have full rights of citizenship until 1958. But 1945 showed that France wanted to hold on to its entire colonial empire, not just Algeria. The situation can't be explained in purely economic terms. It's true, changing economic patterns made it easier for Britain to withdraw from India. But despite the horrors of France's long and unnecessary wars, there's no evidence that France suffered economically from the loss of its colonial territories. The wars took place in the period often referred to as the Trente Glorieuses, the 30 glorious years, the long post-war boom from 1945 to 75. 1968, just 6 years after Algerian independence, The Economist published a glowing account of French economic life, which noted that since 1958, France had prospered mightily and that the average Frenchman eats and drinks better than the average Englishman and is more likely to have a car. The irony was that The Economist actually published that report in the third week of May 1968 during the biggest general strike in history. French capitalism was very easily able to adapt to life without colonies. The Renault management were having talks with the FLN, presumably with a view to future marketing, before Algeria became independent. It was not French capital, but the army and the settlers who imposed Algerian independence and made withdrawal so difficult. The role of the United States is also important. During World War II, especially while Roosevelt was still alive, the USA was actively opposed to colonialism and against the re-establishment of the European empires. Despite the rhetoric, this didn't result from compassion from the poor and huddled masses of the world. but rather from a recognition that if the European empires were to withdraw, it would make it easier to spread US political and economic influence. British Labour, from the very start, was slavishly pro-American. This continued with the setting up of NATO and the opposition to Suez. The one-time British foreign policy seriously diverged from American wishes. In France, things were more complex. The Communist Party was obviously pro-Russian, though willing to police a brief post-war honeymoon. De Gaulle, due to his wartime experiences, was much more suspicious of the Americans, as was shown by his partial withdrawal from NATO in the 1960s. It was only after the removal of both de Gaulle and the PCF that a French government, headed by the Socialist Party, was able to take an openly pro-American position in the incipient Cold War. In 1945, the French government was distrustful of the Americans, and that distrust was manifested in a concern to maintain the French Empire. There's also the fact of the instability of the Fourth Republic, as contrasted to the much vaunted stability of the British two-party system, now happily disintegrating around our ears. But this was a secondary factor. Italy too had an unstable parliamentary system, but it survived repeated governmental crises without anybody much noticing. Italy had no colonies to shed. However, I want to argue the fundamental difference between French and British political choices in 1945 was the Republican tradition that dominated French political thinking, especially on the left. This easily accommodated the notion that France's role in the world was a progressive one, bringing civilization and enlightenment to more benighted territories. This was summed up by one left-wing thinker, Gilles Martinet. Behind the refusal of many socialist militants to recognise the legitimacy of the Algerian demand for independence, it was possible to detect the idea that nothing was superior to being a citizen of the Republic, one and indivisible, and that an African, Arab or black, could hope for nothing better than to become purely and simply French. I realise that reference to a tradition opens me up to accusations of idealism, but the tradition had a very solid material base, namely the French educational system. This has been and remains a central institution of French society. In France today, just under a quarter of the population are involved in the education system, either as employees or as students. The establishment of an education system to inculcate national values into all children was closely tied up with the development of French imperialism. It's no coincidence that the architect of the French education system, Jules Ferry, was also a prime mover in the colonisation of Indochina. The establishment of a school teacher in every village ensured that there was a force to counter the influence of the priests, who might put their allegiance to the Vatican ahead of their duty to the French state. Especially after the separation of church and state in 1905, the education system aimed to outweigh any rival loyalties that might exist in the population. The vicious anti-Semitism in the Dreyfus case and the subsequent rise of left anti-clericalism were two sides of the same coin. It was French primary education and its ideology of laïcité, secularism, that dragooned millions of peasants into the trenches in 1914. In 1920, it briefly appeared that a section of the French left had broken with Republican imperialist ideology in the newly formed French Communist Party. But with the Popular Front of the 1930s, the Communists reverted to the Republican family. The view that the Comintern's Popular Front strategy was relatively successful in France, whereas it had much more meagre results elsewhere, was precisely because the Popular Front corresponded to a long tradition of Republican unity. One important manifestation of Popular Frontism was that the Communist Party dropped the demand for Algerian independence. Party leader Torres used the specious argument that recognising the right to divorce does not imply that one should advocate divorce in a particular instance. Fair enough, but the implication was that France's relations with its colonies were comparable to a happy marriage. In fact, if France was wedded to its colonies, it had been very much a forced marriage. The Communist Party's conduct in 1945 is sometimes explained primarily in terms of its subordination to Moscow. Certainly true, the Communist Party remained a solidly pro-Moscow organisation, as was shown by its sharp tack to the left, with the start of the Cold War in 1947. The Communist Party's line over Sétif and Indochina was determined not just by allegiance to Moscow, but above all by its location in the Republican tradition, which ensured that its policies would receive acceptance from its mass base. The strength of that tradition is shown by the way that most of the French left, including the far left, continues to regard laïcité as something positive to be defended by the left. Yet it's clear that in fact laïcité has become one of the factors supporting Islamophobia. In 2013, a Socialist Party Minister of the Interior supported the sacking of a nursery worker for wearing the hijab, arguing that the headscarf remained an essential battle for the Republic. In general, it appears that governments of the right handle decolonisation better than those of the left. The left in power, because it's afraid of losing votes by seeming too internationalist, is constantly looking over its shoulder to prove that it's just as patriotic as its rivals. It was de Gaulle, not the French left, who withdrew from Algeria. Such an ardent nationalist had no fear of being seen unpatriotic. Until the Bush duo broke the pattern, it was the rule in American politics that the Democrats started wars and the Republicans finished them. Though I persist in believing that if Gore had won in 2000, he would have nuked Iraq. British Labour was equally attached to imperialism. Jan Saville writes of Labour's post-1945 Foreign Secretary. For Bevin, then, the empire was integrally linked with his constant insistence that Britain was still a great power alongside the USA and the Soviet Union. Yet British Labour has always been more pragmatic than the French left. Eclectic in its roots, allegedly owing more to Methodism than to Marxism, Labour has never believed itself to be part of a revolutionary tradition. Sections of the British Francophile left, captivated by the French left intelligentsia of the 50s, have argued that the British left was defective in comparison with the French because it was short on theory. Perry Anderson claimed, with a typically cavalier disregard for historical fact, that mature socialist theory was developed in precisely the years of the British proletariat's amnesia and withdrawal. In France, in Germany, in Italy, Marxism swept the working class. In England, everything was against it. In fact, I think it's very important to recognise the ambiguities of the French revolutionary tradition. The revolutionary slogan, "War on the palaces, peace to the cottages," was indeed a declaration of support for the oppressed of all nations. But it also carried the implication that France had a special role, a civilising mission in liberating the oppressed. Both the British and French lefts are still bound by the past. Many on the British left celebrate the spirit of 45, title of Ken Loach's inept and mendacious movie, setting on one side the fact that Attlee broke strikes, the army was used 18 times against striking workers, sent troops into Indochina and Indonesia, and decided to manufacture nuclear weapons without even consulting the cabinet. Meanwhile, much of the French left continues to fetishise laïcité, ignoring its deep roots in the history of French imperialism. Both the British and the French lefts need to scrutinise their own history in the light of the present. Such scrutiny is one of the most urgent tasks for socialist historians.
We want to discuss that or not later, but first of all, let's bring in Mike Sheridan just to talk a little bit about the Labour Independent Group. Mike.
Yeah, it will just be a few comments. I mean, if you're foolhardy, you can read the article online.
I'll bring it up.
And I'm not going to be as fiercely polemical as Ian was. It's going to be a description of what happened in this period. I got interested in the Labour Independent Group because they were a group of left-wingers of the sort that we didn't see much of in later years.
Found it.
I described them in the article as being Stalinists. Well, and some people may object to that, but I think if you stood a member of the Labour Independent Group next to a member of the Communist Party at that time, you probably couldn't prize a copy of the Daily Worker between them. They were that close, I think, although the Labour Independent Group people chose to be in the Labour Party. There were about 5 of them. They had all been expelled from the Labour Party by 1949 for various disruptions of discipline, as the Labour leadership saw it. They weren't all expelled at the same time, so they weren't initially a cohesive group. They became a Labour independent group simply because they continued to sit in the House of Commons as Labour independents. And they became a group simply because they were all being attacked, I think. Although many of their views, of course, overlapped. I think you can't understand why there were such MPs unless we go back and understand the nature of the Labour movement at that time. And remember, it was a movement. It wasn't just the Parliamentary Labour Party. It wasn't just the Labour Party. The trades unions had a much higher membership than they've got now. They were influential in a number of important sectors of industry, and they influenced a great, they exercised a great influence on the Labour Party. And the Labour movement was much wider than that. The constituency parties were quite strong. There were organisations who were affiliated to them, socialist groups like the Socialist Medical Association, the Fabian Society, and so on. There was a real movement at that time of the sort that really doesn't exist anymore. I'd like to read out a couple of quotes. These were things which were said at the Labour Party conferences in 1944 and 1945. In 1944, Ian Mercado, who was to become an MP in 1945, moved a resolution to include in the party's programme, I quote, the transfer to public ownership of the land, large-scale building, heavy industry, and all forms of banking, transport, and fuel and power. That resolution was passed. But naturally, most of it wasn't implemented by the Labour government, but it gives a flavour of how different those times were. There's a quote from the 1945 Labour Party conference where the speaker said that a Labour government should have a clear foreign policy completely distinct from the Tory party. The speaker went on to say that the socialist revolution had already begun in Europe and was already established in many countries in Eastern and Southern Europe. The person who said that was Dennis Healy, and we all know the way that Healy developed in later years. But you get a flavour in those things of the atmosphere of the time. Pro-Soviet attitudes were also quite acceptable at that time. I think the kudos of the 1917 revolution was still very widespread, not just in the Labour movement, but much wider than that. We'd just come out of the Second World War, where many British working people could see the enormous contribution which Russian forces had played in that war. So there was a lot of sympathy towards the regime in Moscow. What changed everything, of course, was the coming of the Cold War, where people were being asked to make choices between the Kremlin on the one hand and what became American imperialism on the other hand. At that stage, many people on the left simply opted for the Washington choice. That included the printed voice of the Labour left at the time, Tribune, which was militantly pro-Washington, I think it would be true to say, and became extremely hostile to the Russian government. We also all know about George Orwell, who was quite influential at the time, and his attitudes, which of course have been shaped, I think, largely in the Spanish Civil War, but Orwell was as implacably anti-Stalinist as I think any Tory could have been. And I'm rather glad John Newsing is not here today, although I wish him good health, because he would disagree with what I'm going to say now. But as we also know, Orwell passed to a branch of the Foreign Office a whole list of people who were alleged pro-Stalinists, who he considered would cooperate with a pro-Stalinist government in this country. Now, to me, that's an unforgivable thing. I know John wouldn't necessarily take that point of view. But it also gives a flavour of how much things have changed since 1945, that those sort of attitudes were developing quite strongly on the left. The other thing is that financially, Britain, and I think this has been alluded to by the main speakers, financially Britain was very dependent upon the United States at the time. There was Marshall aid. It's also true that something like 40% of British imports were coming from the USA at that time. So the trade with the USA was huge. The people who became the Labour Independent Group MPs were a thorn in the flesh of the Labour leadership over some years. There was an incident when a whole group of Labour MPs sent a telegram to Pietro Nenni of the Italian Socialist Party, wishing him all the best in the forthcoming Italian election in 1947. Of course, Nenni at that time was in collaboration with the Italian Communist Party, and they formed the Democratic Popular Front. The Labour leadership, not surprisingly, took a dim view of that. But what really, I think, brought the thing to the boil was that a group of 6 MPs voted against the ratification of the formation of NATO. And it was after that that the remainder of the Labour Independent Group MPs were expelled. In fact, 4 of the 5 of them did issue a manifesto in 1950 when they all stood as Labour independents. I say 4 of the 5. The one who didn't was Connie Ziliakis, who was probably the most independent of them. And maybe he has pro-Stalinist attitudes, but famously, of course, he favoured the Tito line rather than the Stalin line, and that put him out of sync with his colleagues, and he paddled his own canoe from then on. Now, the Labour Independent Group had mainly focused on foreign policy matters, but they were able to put this paragraph in their 1950 manifesto. They say the Labour government could have exercised a far greater check than it did over profit seekers, could have given the workers real control over industry, could have taken over with far less expense the industry scheduled for nationalisation by cutting compensation, and could have withdrawn them wholly from the management of those who had hitherto run them for private interests. I suspect most people around this table, maybe even Francis Beckett if he was still here, I don't know, might agree with that. But it shows they weren't purely a group who opposed the government on foreign policy. So for all those reasons, I was particularly interested in them as an historical fragment, if you like, of a type that obviously couldn't reappear today. Stalinism is dead. Whatever communist party there may exist in this country is of little consequence. I'm not offending anybody around the table. Don't look at me. And the whole and the labour movement, as existed at that time, has evaporated. However, all the issues which they raise, of course, still exist. And if you want to draw up, part of the blurb for this conference was to draw up an historical balance sheet. Well, we could do worse than to look at some of the things in this manifesto, which I think would be things that many people would sympathise with. The issues which they've raised, however, are still here. They're still raised politically. What should a Labour or a Socialist government do? And they're still raised industrially, of course, with issues like state planning, workers' control, and all the rest of it. So I think they represent a really important and fascinating historical fragment.
Thanks very much, Mike. Very interesting. Does anybody have any?
He didn't name them. He didn't name them.
Points?
I named them.
Yes.
Yeah. Apart from Connie Ziliakis, the other one.
John Platts Mills.
John
Yes,
Platts
yeah.
Mills was really the leader of them, I think. Leslie Sully and Lester Hutchinson, who he was showing at this election video a few moments ago. Lester Hutchinson actually stood against Attlee in the 1950 election. He was decimated, of course, by Attlee. But he gave up his own constituency and stood against Attlee as a way of getting great publicity, I suppose. The other one who became involved with them was a chap called D.M. Pritt, who was already a Labour independent in 1945 because he'd been expelled from the Labour Party in 1940 for supporting the Russian incursion into Finland. So those were the basic five who were involved.
Any points people want to? The full text is, as you can see on the website there for you to. Is that yes? Then I'll bring it in. Yes.
When industries were nationalised, like the railways or coal mines, was there any movement from any section of the Labour Party to have a different way of running those as opposed to the traditional government worker opposition?
I'm not aware that any of the recognised sections of the Labour Party put forward that point of view, no. It became an issue. I think it was an issue which was really raised from below when workers in those industries became aware that things hadn't changed very much. They then began to put pressure on their trades unions and so on, and the issue became focused in that way, I think. I remember, however, I'm not sure how many of the traditional Labour lefts were really influenced by ideas of industrial democracy in that sense. I remember many years later being in a meeting in the 1960s, being in a meeting addressed by Michael Foot, when I actually asked him if he was in favour of workers' control or industrial democracy in nationalised industries. And he answered very firmly in the negative. No, he didn't think it was appropriate for those. So I think there was quite a lot of opposition to that because it was considered that any democratic control should come from Westminster rather than from the workers in the industries.